Last Sunday, I asked you, what would you talk about if Jesus visited you? I raised the question in the context of the biblical readings of that day that dealt with conversations Abraham had with messengers from God, and which Mary and Martha had with Jesus. And though these were in-person, face-to-face conversations with God among us, I suggest that the same may spiritually occur in the context of prayer, which is the topic of today's sermon. Last Sunday, I mentioned that in the Hebrew scriptures, God was actively engaged in the discourse with divinely anointed ones, as in God's conversation with Abraham concerning his heir. However, since Jesus is commonly understood as the Word of God incarnate, there is no such dialogue between him and God. And even when Jesus desperately sought this interaction, as in his prayer at Gethsemane, to be spared the agony of the cross, and his prayer on the cross, wondering why God had forsaken him, God seemed silent. You might be interested in knowing that in the Bible, there are 3 divinely chosen individuals who contend with God, hoping to change God's mind. The first is Abraham, who bartered with God, convincing the angels not to destroy the city of Sodom if 10 righteous individuals were found there. One naturally wonders, since Abraham was on a roll with God, why he stopped at 10. Biblical scholars suggest that there was not much any group numbering less than 10 could do in changing the evil intent of a society. The second divinely chosen one is Moses, who convinced God not to destroy those who followed him out of Egypt when God saw them resorting to the worship of idols, while Moses was away from them with God on Mount Sinai. Moses convinced God to remember the promise he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we are told that the Lord repented of the evil that he thought to do to his people. This begs the question, was it God's evil intent that Jesus should be offered up as a human sacrifice for the sins of the world? Jesus is the third anointed one of God who sought to change God's mind, but unlike Abraham and Moses, was unable to do so, and therefore resolved that it was not his will, but God's will that must be done. But what loving Lord would willingly sacrifice an innocent child? To further beg the question, what loving Lord, creator of life, creator of the universe, would annihilate an entire society if 10 righteous people are not found? Or destroy an entire civilization for choosing other means and modes of worship? Christians and other seekers of God in today's world are gradually extricating themselves from belief in a punitive divine dictator who destroys anyone and anything in his way that doesn't bend to his ironclad rules. If, according to John's first epistle, God is love, then, as mentioned in last Sunday's sermon, God lovingly offers us the choice between life according to God's design and death of our own making. There are nations and societies, including our own, that are hell-bent on self-destruction. Yet within them and within each of us also abides the compassionate presence of God, enduring hardship, sacrifice, even death, so that God's way of life may be seen and sought. Jesus died on the cross not because of God, but because he was to us a righteous pain in the butt, constantly annoying us of the wrongs to which we were accustomed, to the extent that we had to get rid of him. God did not kill Jesus, we did. And we continue to crucify him as long as our will and not God's will is done. Now, in prayer, it is important that God knows our will. Jesus said, when you pray, go into your room, shut the door, and pray to God in secret, because it is only during our private moments with God that we are free to unleash the heights and depths, the joys and sorrows, the wholeness and emptiness, the gratitude and shame of our lives, without fear of judgment from others, trusting that this compassionate God will understand us like no other. But private prayer becomes problematic when reserved solely to private places and personal petitions. Prayer also requires a public dimension in which our private petitions become aware of the desperate needs of others in an attempt to embody the universal heart of God. This means that every time we ask, it may not always be given, and that God, through us, will experience gains and losses. Good people will die for spiritually unexplainable reasons, from acts of nature that destroy entire communities, from terminal illness that prematurely takes the lives of loved ones. These occurrences will happen alongside explainable, selfish causes of human suffering and death. Prayer is not about you and me alone. It is the acknowledgement that we are in community and that we live in community with and for one another and with and for God. God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. During a children's sermon, a child asked, "Where is heaven?" I answered, "Heaven is wherever God is in control. Within the resources of our planet, along with our physical, spiritual, and mental resources, God has provided us the way of life, the ability to feed, house, and sustain one another and all of creation if we allow God's will and not our will to be done. Listen and see that the presence of God surrounds and fills you with the wonder and blessings you receive from creation, as well as in the love and compassion you give to one another, you give to your world, and you give to your God. When the love and the will of God become the focus of your prayer and your life, then ask and you shall receive. Seek and you shall find. Knock and the door shall be opened to you. Amen.